Just to give you a short introduction, spending the last this semester really working on the anthropogenic markers that were being discussed at the Hakka conference, because we attended it and were very inspired by the debate and also the talk that you gave. And on Monday, we'll be presenting some of the exploration that we did, and we are focusing a lot on radiation, as you can see here in the cloud tracers in the cloud chamber that we built to study radioactive materialities around us, from the legacies of distant supernovas to our relationship with radiation, and to using radionuclides as an Anthropocene marker. So we are four. That's the fourth person. Andres from Argentina. Julia is from...
I'm from Germany. I'm from Dortmund. Yeah.
And I'm from Singapore. And Belen.
And I'm from Ecuador.
Yeah, so we're a very, very international team, and we kind of work on this together to try to find our own connection with the project. And this is the four of us building the chamber. And as part of the exhibition, we wanted to provide a better understanding to radiation. And that's why we wanted to have this interview with you, because we feel like there's no better person who can answer these very difficult questions. And that's me sitting over there next to you, taking my notes. Yeah.
Okay.
So we attended this particular conference and also later on the talk that you gave. And it was very interesting to witness the debate between the hard and the soft sciences. So today we want to go a bit deeper with these questions. Yeah.
We were thinking about different sides to approach, and one is the public perception of radiation itself. And at the panel discussion, you were already also talking about it. So did geologist Andy Kandi, and he uses a banana to talk about the ubiquity of radiation. Geologist Colin Wallace also compare radioactive incidents or nuclear tests with cosmic radiation in an effort to dispel fears about radiation. But despite the efforts of nuclear scientists, the fear of radiation lingers within the public. And you talk about this fear and its incomprehensible nature in the essay Radiation, Fear and Trust as part of the Anthropocene curriculum. And we were wondering if you could share more about this rational fear of radiation in light of the history of radioactive accidents and the use of nuclear marker to mark the Anthropocene.
You know, the public perception of radiation varies significantly across different countries and even within communities and even within a given community. And the public fear of radiation is probably justified by the fact that uncertainty and unknowns and limitations of knowledge are usually not clearly stated by official current authority experts, official experts, and they have had a long practice of secrecy. And in the current authoritative knowledge that we have on radiation's health effects, sometimes the people say that there are no unknowns, and they minimize what is unknown. That's the reason why I think that the choice of nuclear markers such as plutonium to mark the onset of the Anthropocene would have the merit to emphasize that radiations and the radiations of plutonium challenge our ordinary measurements and ordinary timelines. You may know that plutonium-239 has a half-life of 24,110 years of half-life. It means that half of its radioactivity will decay in more than 24,000 years. Therefore, it provides excellent chronological markers in ice, sediment, and corals. That's why they want to identify it as the marker. But plutonium has been made for nuclear weapons, and it's also present in smaller proportions in nuclear reactors, which is the major danger. So plutonium-239 emits alpha radiations that enter the body through food or drink. So these dangerous radionuclides are still present in the slits carried by the river that runs through Chernobyl and that irrigates the large basin and flows then into the river Dnieper. So the disaster of 1986 is not over. This is what we call a slow disaster. The public, tends to forget that the disaster is not an instantaneous event. The public has no memory of slow disaster like that, because people are concerned when the accident happens and then they forget.
I think what is really difficult is that it is a continuous experience, and we, with our perceptions as humans, we cannot grasp it really on how long it really will last in our environment. We cannot think about the generations to come that will still be affected by that. So yeah, that was a really, really great point that you made. But we also want to talk a little more about your research in Japan.
So, the Fukushima nuclear disaster happened in 2011. More than a decade later, we are still grappling with its repercussions, as Japan's plans to dump contaminated water into the sea was announced last year. Your latest book, Living in a Nuclear World from Fukushima to Hiroshima, explores our relationship with radiation and the lingering trauma and memories that continue to influence our perception of radiation. Could you tell us more about why you decided to dive into this research and your insights from the writing process?
Oh yes, sure. Thank you. What compelled us, us is the three of us. Kyoko Sato, who is a Japanese STS scholar, professor at Stanford University, and Soraya Boudia, who is a French colleague, professor at Paris University and expert in risk management, the history of risk management. What compelled us, the three of us, to investigate what it means living in a nuclear world is because 5 years after Fukushima, we started to work in 2016. And we realized that 5 years after Fukushima, people have tended to forget, We were really concerned by the facility to forget nuclear events. And we wanted to understand that after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, about 30 nations decided to equip with nuclear reactors, including Japan. Japan, who had been the victim of nuclear technology, decided to start to embrace nuclear energy. And how, despite major disasters and assertions that they won't happen again, nuclear technology has been widely adopted and accommodated. And of course, there had been waves of critics of nuclear technology, but they never stopped the enthusiasm to embrace nuclear energy. So we wonder, how is it that we get adapted to disaster? And after Fukushima disasters, experts were mobilized, risk standards and stress tests were updated. Yet, Fukushima gradually became a thing of the past, a memory, like the bombs of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. all these events have been trivialized, normalized. They have become so commonplace that they are considered as normal. And this is what we really wanted to understand. And the book explores the history of how life with numerous nuclear reactors, elevated radiation levels, and threat of nuclear weapons or nuclear accidents, and how they have been normalized, and what are the processes of normalization. And we finally identified 4 major dynamics at work in this normalization process. First is the minimization of the intrinsic violence of nuclear fission through a number of management categories, like, for instance, dual-use technology, which puts all the evil on military uses of nuclear technology and all the good on nuclear energy. And also the classifications, classifications of victims and damages, or delineation between the safe and the dangerous zones after an accident. All these bureaucratic categories of classification helped really normalize the accidents and the bombs. Another process is the pacification of atoms through containment, control, and international governance with international institutions like IAEA, for instance, which are in charge of surveillance of nuclear reactors all over the world. A third mechanism is the denial of the possibility of disasters through a culture of secrecy, ignorance, and blindness among nuclear milieu, especially nuclear engineers in many countries. And the final process is the forgetfulness. It's the regime of temporality based on forgetfulness, memorializations, and visions of the future that help us to simply embrace the facility of modern life and conception and forget about the victims and the negative consequence of nuclear technology.
You mentioned this phrase, but this concept of citizen science. So that really caught my attention because it's kind of the democratization of information about the nuclear sites and events and consequences. So perhaps this normalization and this secrecy of the real consequences or the manipulation of how to normalize nuclear energy, but not like nuclear disasters for nuclear armory. Perhaps now that we have more platforms that are democratized, kind of, for example, social media could be another way, perhaps to get out the information and stop the secrecy about the nuclear spectrum and the consequences of it. Perhaps that is a way to maintain memory, to not forget, because we are living in another age where information is more accessible, and actually we all could be not just the creators of this information, but also like activists of that.
We have to think about what people or citizen scientists are doing when they themselves measure radiations around the place where they live. And what it means for citizen scientists who can build the machines through which we can understand radiation. It's important, and it has been studied by a number of social scientists. you know that Japanese citizens groups, there are many of them after Fukushima, who either in their municipality or even in Tokyo started measuring food and soils after the disaster of Fukushima. They didn't trust the Japanese authorities or their capacity to know the local situation for their everyday food, especially given the difficulty, you know, all the secrecy. And it's something that more than 30 independent labs, which are active, and they are held by farmers, evacuees, sometimes by anti-nuclear scientists. They perform measures, but they also organize talk meetings. In fact, they are trying to organize all activities geared towards the needs of the local communities. And I think that these measuring devices and the know-how that they acquire allow these citizens to detect radiation presence and exposure in their everyday life. And they really oppose the official statistics, because the official statistics tend to average out the data collected, and they don't give you exactly the risk in a locality. And so residents and citizen scientists, I would say, really acquired a capacity to know what is safe for them and when it's contaminated, and to oppose to the global statistics. And on the other hand, I think that this capacity is ambivalent, you know, because it has been used by the Japanese government to justify and normalize life with radiation risk. If you can cope with that, you citizens, well, it's okay. And to a certain extent, they tend to de-responsibilize in any way. I think, and I've read a number of papers by STS scholars who did field work in these groups of citizen scientists in Japan after Fukushima. And what they argue is that we shouldn't understand these groups and movement activists as citizen scientists as we know them in the Western countries, because they are not really critical. They are more just helping local communities. You know, they are mainly concerned with the interest of local people. So the Japanese understanding of citizen engagement seems to be different, because it's not really always the expression of distrust of experts. It's more cooperation or joint exploration aimed at beneficial outcomes for local communities and scientists. At least this is what I've read. And I've met in Japan a number of anti-nuclear citizens, but it seems that it's not a global movement, even after Fukushima.
It was very insightful to hear about also the comparison of citizen scientists between the West and Japan. We want to go to the next question, which goes deeper into this topic about local versus global measurements. When we look at the patchiness of radiation and how, for example, historian Kate Brown was investigating the blueberry supply trail in the region around Chernobyl, and how those blueberries with the berry pickers would supply to the supermarkets in Europe. So it could be supplying to a global diet of cesium to today, and people tend to think that they are very far away from the source of radiation, but they really aren't. And this image of the Toshiba imaging camera taken in a documentary in NHK that shows the patchiness of radioactive, high levels of radioactivity, which responds to what you were saying just now about how the average numbers doesn't tally with these very high numbers in certain local sites. And with these two examples, do they serve to illustrate your point on the need to understand the specific local inner dynamics of ecologies over, let's say, the global sites that we saw at the Hakabe conference on the anthropogenic markers, which was focusing more on global numbers?
Yeah, the patchy ecologies of radiation are really difficult to track and understand thoroughly. And yet, local residents are always subject to their risk daily from food, dust, rain, and other elements. And as is the case with the Chernobyl surrounding studied by Kate Brown, such dynamics in Fukushima slip through official knowledge and governance. Traces of cesium ingested in Chernobyl by berry and mushroom eaters brought strong evidence of the deep impact of radiation on local ecosystems. And they are invisible but ubiquitous. And the traces of cesium carried by the Pacific Ocean from Fukushima to British Columbia brought also about a strong evidence of the mobility of radiation and their global impact. So, in my view, radionuclides are typical exemplars of what Michel Serres, the French philosopher who died 2 or 3 years ago, what he named world objects. World objects are objects that are locally implemented, but which have a global impact. Nuclear waste and internet are such objects. And they raise serious issues of governance and control. As Kate Brown argues, for many years, the clearly detectable saturation of the northern hemisphere with radioactive fallout did not ring an alarm among scientists and among official authorities. And people were not concerned with the harm it was causing. And for a few decades, scientists kept talking about the resiliency of ecosystems and the resiliency of the Earth system itself. So just as we tend to forget disasters, we tend to deny the interdependency of ecosystems and to believe that there are strict demarcations between safe and dangerous zones. And that is where the neoliberal approaches of measuring to continue to live in the contaminated areas, often in the name of choice, dignity, and empowerment, come in, People believe that if we assume that we can draw a line or a threshold between what is dangerous and not dangerous, we are okay, but we are never okay. The world, the entire planet, is contaminated with radionuclides.
This is a really great point to our next topic and the medium of perception, on how we as the normal citizen can actually explore radiation and understand also radiation. And it's such a loaded topic. And when we share our research with others, it always feels like giving a lecture, and there's so much to understand. And it's so important to understand the science behind it. But we also talked about accessibility. A lot of it is in secrecy, and a lot of normal citizens don't necessarily understand it. And part of our project is trying to break the accessibility barrier between science and the public. So we found a discarded aquarium tank on the streets, and we used it to build a cloud chamber with alcohol bought in a neighborhood pharmacy, and an oven metal tray, a placemat made out of felt, and dry ice. So we already talked a little bit about what it means when we become citizen scientists, but I kind of want to ask more about what it really means, or how can we build machines to use it as a medium to understand radiation?
Yeah, we can build self-made machines, self-made counters, and it's probably a way to better understand the way how radiation works, especially the decay, the half-life, and things like that. But at the same time, it's also maybe a way to be more aware of the everyday contamination and of the it not only from radioactivity, but also from chemicals. So I think that it's really empowerment. But as I mentioned a moment ago, it's a bit ambivalent, because this empowerment helps official authorities to assume that it's our collective responsibility to live in a contaminated world. And it's not our, we can say perhaps that for chemicals, because we use chemicals as individuals, as consumers. But it's not the case for radioactivity. Radioactivity, we didn't want it. We didn't choose it. We were not consulted. And my country went into nuclear technology without asking citizens. It was never debated. And we should have next in France, next March, the parliament should make decisions about the creation, the implementation of 12 new nuclear reactors. And I'm really concerned by that, because today the public perception of nuclear energy is that it's clean energy because it's carbon free, and because it produces carbon free electricity. But this is really a myopic view. It's a view, no, not a far-sighted view. It results from the social construction of collective amnesia, of collective ignorance, of the slow, invisible impacts of radiation on bodies and on the environment. And it's a long impact, and which is even more worrying than the carbon impact on the atmosphere. It's the carbon impact on the carbon life, the life of CO2 in the atmosphere is about 100 years. And the half-life of plutonium is 24,000 years. So it's not commensurable. No, it's not comparable.
We want to say thank you, Bernadette, for taking the time. We were researching on this topic a lot, and it was really hard to understand. So we really appreciate you being at the HKW, us being able to access this information, and also for you making the time today for the exhibition. And yeah,
thank you.
In Berlin.
Thank you. Thank you for the time you spent on this project, which is a beautiful project. Thank you. Bye.